And I got bored and I did what everyone does at that stage in their career, which is to go to prison. We are far more the products of our environment than we like to believe. So there's a difference between what caused something and who's accountable for it. When you're under pressure is when you tend to run on automatic. That's when you don't think about what you're doing. You just do what comes naturally to you. Is your instinctive kind of behavior, and that's the stuff which is most influenced by genetics, by childhood. Power reduces every single leader who holds it, and the more of it that they have and the longer they have it for, the more that it will reduce it. And one of the things it does is it's a wonderful ego booster, right? What matters is whether your people feel cared for. The information reaching to us is decaying. We're becoming more and more confident, but I'm already beginning to think this doesn't sound like a recipe for success.
Nik, thank you for coming on our podcast. And could you share maybe at a high level about your circuitous journey through psychotherapy, corporate leadership roles, consulting, and forensic work?
Sure. So, hi. Yeah. My name is Nik Kinley. I started off career in kind of sales and marketing roles. I did it for about 6 years. And I drifted in that because I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And then I got bored and I did what everyone does at that stage in their career, which is to go to prison. I should say not because at Her Majesty's kind of pleasure or instruction, but more because I retrained as a psychologist and psychotherapist, and I spent 10, 12 years in that environment. And what I was doing in there was kind of assessing people for courts and trying to change their behavior. And really, that's the gig I've been in for about the last 35 years. So I stayed doing that, as I said, for about a decade. I kind of moved out from there and I moved into business consulting. So I was, or leadership consulting. I did that for 5 or 6 years. I moved out because I felt I needed some corporate experience. And so I worked in corporate HR for the likes of BP and Barclays. I went back into consulting, where I worked across the Middle East and Asia in particular. And then I came out and I now kind of work for myself for the last kind of 18 months or so. I've now got my own company. Alongside of that, for the last 15 years, I've kind of led a research program with colleagues over at IMD Business School, which much to my wife's dismay has led to kind of like 8, 9 books now. I haven't quite figured out how to tell her yet that there's going to be a 9th one. I figure a nice bit meal, a nice bottle of wine or something, and maybe I'll drop it into conversation at the end. I don't know. But that's kind of, I have to tell her that. And so I'm quite lucky. I get to say that I've worked with royalty, politicians, children, murderers, and we can have a conversation later about which of those are the most difficult to actually kind of deal with. So I've kind of probably in my career, I've probably assessed over about 1,500 senior leaders. I coach the list in terms of the types of people that I've assessed. If it gives you a sense, just in the last year, it would include the CEOs of national banks, the heads of national security, hedge fund bosses, engineering leads for Formula One teams, managers of children's care homes. So I get around a fair bit. I'm old enough and lucky enough that I tend to only work at the most senior ends of organizations now. I do a fair bit of coaching with that same kind of population as well. And that's really where I spend my time. I work as an assessor trying to help organizations reduce the risk and uncertainty involved in hiring leaders. And I then kind of work with leaders in terms of helping them navigate the sheer levels of uncertainty that they're facing in the business environment at the moment, and try and help them make sure that the companies that they're trying to lead don't fall into strategic drift, and that they somehow manage to maintain grip, and that they somehow keep people focused on what's important. And that's mostly what I spend my time on.
Impressive. You've worked with quite an array of people in leadership. What did those extremes teach you about human nature? You mentioned royalty, criminals, politicians, children even.
So I think that I think they taught me a fair bit of humility, would be the first thing I'd say. That actually, there but by the grace of God go I, is probably a phrase that I've found myself using quite often. people are able to survive, that life finds a way, that people are able to survive the most awful circumstances. And although I've sat in front of some people who you might think have done some awful things and have done some really awful things, at the same time, I've looked at them and thought, well, you know what? If I was in their shoes, I don't know if I would have ended up doing any different if I'd gone through the sheer circumstances that they had and the upbringing that they had. So one of the things that I learned was that we are far more the products of our environment than we like to believe. And indeed, the book before last that I wrote, Rewriting Your Leadership Code, was actually, the fun's all in the subtitle, how your childhood made you the leader you are and what you can do about it. And when we dug into the research, and we had a look at 50 years kind of research on it, I think we are, I think the research is absolutely clear that we are far more led by our childhood experiences, by the sensitivities and tendencies and preferences and predispositions that they engender within us than we like to admit. And that we are far more the result of those early experiences. And if you come from an environment that unfortunately does terrible things to you, then you are far more likely to end up having to do terrible things in order to survive. Now, that does not excuse those people, because I think that there is a big difference. So one of the other things I learned is that there's a big difference between authorship and accountability. So I think that we can hold someone accountable for something and at the same time say, but you know what? The things that caused it were X and Y. Right? And I think that's really important. So there's a difference between what caused something and who's accountable for it. And if you think about it, I think this is something we often forget to our detriment within organizations. So we'll look at a poor performing employee, and in holding them, I think it's only right that we should hold a poor performing employee accountable for their poor performance, right? But we'll often look at them and go, well, they're crap, right? And it's because they're crap, right? They've performed poorly because they're a poor performer, full stop. And we move on. And what we may not consider is that maybe they're the wrong person in the wrong job, or maybe they are, or maybe yes. And so that's kind of, or you may see a leader really struggling, right? And they might be incredibly good leader, but they might just be in incredibly difficult circumstances. Mm-hmm. So it's, so one of the things that I've learned is that there, but by the grace of God, by Isaac, that we are far more the products of our circumstances than we like to believe. The second thing is that there is that we need to remember that there is a big difference between authorship and accountability, that how we got to be who we are, and yet at the same time, we are still accountable for how we behave today.
The ratio seems imprecise between nature versus nurture. And an analogy that I use is like a piano. So for like epigenetics, you've got the piano keys, and then depending on the pianist, they might put a little bit more pressure. It might have a different resonance depending on the maker of the piano. For example, I assume that in your town, other people speak with a similar accent to you. So you like that. Everyone kind of agreed on that. However, you probably have some people that have a different disposition toward certain activities or certain views. And so it's almost like an amplifier or perhaps a algorithmic penalty, depending on the underlying genetic sequence of the piano keys. Again, for that, call back to that analogy. So I agree from my experience, and by no means am I trying to tell you that I have more research than you, but I'm trying to make sense of what seems to be like a varying definition. And also it seems like these are cardinal directions in a foggy forest rather than concrete, universal truths. So for example, going back to your poor performing employee example, I think that there is some value there that might be mismatched. However, I also think that to be competitive in like business sense, you do need to make some hard decisions eventually, and so it's difficult to. And I realize it's too big of an answer for you to just give like a pithy kind of sentence. But to what degree does that make sense to you as far as the nature versus nurture and the kind of moving target, if you will, or the fluid nature in which we need to make sense?
So fine. Yeah, there's two things there. So first of all, in terms of the nature-nurture debate, because I think it's important that we separate these two things out. So in terms of the nature-nurture debate, it really depends what area of functioning that you're talking about. So what we did is we went back to childhood research and we went back to leadership research. And whereas most stuff out there that you'll find has gone, yeah, sure, there's a link. And I think most people would agree our upbringings affect who we are, right? Who we are as adults. I think most people would agree with that. I don't think there's many people who would deny that either our upbringings affect who we are or that our genetics can affect who we get to be as an adult. As you said, the question is, how much? How? And so we tried to answer that particular question. And we found that the only way that the answer varies significantly according to the area of functioning. And so what we did is that we drilled down and we had a look at 3 particular areas where, and within those, we found sub areas where we could give more specific answers. And we could say, hey, listen, as a leader, this is how it affects you. And this is what you can do about it. And the reason why it's important is that when it is most likely to affect you is when you are under pressure. Mm-hmm. So, because when you are under pressure is when you tend to run on automatic. That's when you don't think about what you're doing, right? You just go on your default response. You just do what comes naturally to you, right? And what comes naturally to you is your instinctive kind of behavior, which is based on years and decades worth of, and that's the kind of stuff which is built on the foundations of what came before. Mm. And that's the stuff which is most influenced by genetics, by childhood. Take something that's most influenced by genetics. The single thing in you that is most influenced by genetics, without a doubt, probably
Physical
not
form?
even your intelligence. And I'm not talking about other than physically, but I'm just in terms of your psychology, is emotional regulation. Now, there is some debate about what percentage. But when you average it out, there was a recent meta-analysis last year, and a meta-analysis is an analysis of other studies, and that kind of came out between 60 to 70% genetically inherited. So, as a parent, if you think about it, if you've got a child that's what I would call an externalizer, cries a lot, or you've got a child that is an internalizer, so it doesn't cry a lot and is very quiet and not actually that responsive, doesn't smile a lot. Now, both of these can have quite an effect upon you as a parent, right? If your child's not responding to you, trying to get it to smile and laugh, that can have a negative effect on you. If your child is kind of crying a lot, well, if you've had kids that, I don't need to finish that sentence, right? Both of those can have a negative effect on you. And what tends to happen is that as a parent, you tend to think, well, that's down to me, right? Oh God, what have I done? But when you look at the studies, it's probably about 60 to 70% of that, which is just purely based on their genetics, right? So, and that is probably the single strongest area. Now, that is just in general how whether they tend to internalize or externalize their emotions. But just take one single emotion, like anxiety. That is built on top. Think about it as layers of a building. Mm-hmm. That is built on top of the more general, whether they are an internalizer of their emotions or an externalizer. So someone who inherits a general tendency, let's say their parents and their grandparents are all massive externalizers of their emotions, right? Display their emotions all over their place, very anxious people. Your parents are anxious, your grandparents are anxious. You know what? I'm going to guess right? You're probably going to end up that way too, right? Everyone shows their anxiety. You probably will as well, right? Well, it's going to be there within you. You're going to feel it very intensely, whether you show it or not. Another matter, right? So how you respond, how you feel anxiety is going to be layered on top of that general tendency, and then how you feel it, respond to it in very particular circumstances is going to be layered on top of that, and all of your experiences become layered on top of it. And then 30, 40 years later, you end up in a meeting, something happens, and it plugs straight into that. Now that's just one thing. That's just genetics. If you want a more social thing, think about how you respond to conflict. That, in the book we show, is directly plugged in to childhood experiences of how your parents respond and demonstrate anger, deal with conflict. And there is very clear evidence, and in the book we kind of show that. And it's just, and that for many of us as leaders, I mean, it's a direct, I wouldn't say daily, monthly, whatever, right? But it's a very common challenge for us as leaders, right? We have to navigate it, how we express our own anger, how we deal with conflict. And it plugs directly. We all like to think, well, I'm very thoughtful. Yeah, but you know what? When someone really riles you up, what comes out, or whether you shrink back, or whether you pull away, or whether you lean into it and take a swing, or whether you try and smooth it all over and keep everyone happy, you know what? That impulse, that is based on something far deeper. So we pull out the research on that and we show it, and we then say, and here's what you can do about it, right? And you have to try and actively manage it, because otherwise, in this world, which, let's face it, isn't getting any easier, isn't getting any, less uncertain, isn't getting any less pressurized. Those moments that matter, those moments which pull these instincts out of you, are becoming more and more frequent. And there's some very clear evidence on that. And every time you rely on those instincts, you are effectively gambling on them. And if you don't at least have some insight into what they are and where they came from, you're effectively gambling blind. It's like going into a casino, gambling, and not even bothering to look at what your cards are.
So now, Charles Darwin's... Sorry, go ahead.
So that was one. Do you want to deal with the Darwin thing, or should I come back and answer your thing about the poor performing employee?
Well, I love the poor performing employee, but if I could maybe interject, since I already put my foot in the pause button.
And you brought up Darwin. I mean, I can't resist that. Right?
He gets misunderstood, at least in North America, with the word fit. It's almost like a translation issue, and people think of Arnold Schwarzenegger as something. And the way that I understand it more recently is that it's more an adaptation, like fit meaning for your environment. So would you say for folks listening that understanding to what degree your like underlying kind of operating system, like how to maybe use it, the incentive or the reason for doing this work or analyzing this is to better adapt to the changing environment? Because I see two things being true at the same time. On one, we live in chaos, and each of us has a totally different reality. You see the varying religions or non-religions. You see politics. You see different preferences, etc. And it seems like we are an 8 billion-eyed consciousness and making sense of chaos. On the other, you see kind of agreements and rules and speed limits and things like this. So we need to kind of adapt to an environment. And some of us are able to affect what that environment is like, maybe more than others. Some of us, maybe to your point, if we understand, or I guess this is my question rather than telling you what your point is the reason for doing what you're doing with these analyses and meta-analyses and the work that you're doing on helping people better adapt, going back to the Darwin theory of fitness?
No. So I mean, yes, but no. Great answer. Just leave it there, right?
Well,
yes,
quantum superposition. Yeah,
how clear can you get? So look, don't think that adapting is enough, right?
Can you explain
not in today's world? Yeah, I mean, not in today's world, right? Where we go from... so wind the clock back 30, 40 years ago.
Oh, you're saying be more agentic.
And yes, episodic volatility was, I mean, 10 years ago, we were talking about agile. You have to be agile, right? Because, the world's becoming more volatile. No, it's not. The world is not becoming more volatile, right? Uncertainty is built into the structure of it, right? That is where we are now, right? It has changed, right? It's gone. We've gone through that whole it's becoming process. It has become, right? It has it's grown up into a brand new. It's had its 18th birthday. It's become something else, right? Congratulations, right? Adapting is not enough. Being agile isn't enough. We have to be more agentic. We have to be more than that, right? And so we have to. There is a degree to which. And I think part of the problem is that for the last 50 years, I want to say 500, but for the last 50 years, the whole HR leadership industry has focused on, and psychologists in particular, and I say that as one of them. Damn those psychologists have focused on what's inside of you. Whether you have the capabilities, whether you have the characteristics to be a leader, right? Are you a caring leader? Are you a caring person, David? Do you know what?
I think everyone is a caring person about what they care about.
It doesn't matter. No, it doesn't matter. It's utterly irrelevant. Well, okay, so it's not entirely irrelevant, but in today's world, there is a degree to which it is irrelevant, because what matters more is not whether you're caring, but whether the people around you feel cared for, and they're not the same. Fundamentally, they are not the same. And HR and psychologists have been telling you, oh, you've got to focus on being caring, you've got to focus on being this, you've got to focus on being that. No, what matters is whether your people feel cared for. What matters is the impact you have. Rather than talking about, let's send you on courses to be caring boss, to be this boss, let's try and actually make your people feel this. Let's focus on that. Because, and this is going to bring us into the whole poor performing employee person, what matters is what you need to achieve. What matters is the impact you need to have in order to achieve that thing. And there's a degree to which, whether you're a kind person and a nice person and a good person matters, of course it does. But also what matters, if you are an employee and you have a job to do, if you're paid to be a leader, is you're being paid, call me old-fashioned, to achieve an outcome, right? And what matters is how do you have the impact that you need to get you and your people to that outcome? Safely, securely, and as in good condition as possible. How do you get everyone to that outcome as positively as possible?
Right? And that presupposes...
And you have to work backwards from that. Sorry.
Okay.
Go on.
Sorry, if you wanted to continue.
So to bring you to the point of the poor performing employee, right? Let's say, so here you are, right? One of your employees just isn't working out. And I am very keen. So let's be really clear. One of the things that I do is that I work with private equity companies post acquisition, right? They use me to come in and help them make sure that the leadership team is capable of delivering the investment thesis. Now, one of the reasons that or even a newly hired leader will fail most quickly, or a leadership team is going to stumble, is because they don't get the team right quickly enough. And if you don't get the team right quickly enough, then the change curve you can deliver, the growth curve you can deliver, just is going to be flatter, right? It's those billiard balls, if you don't start getting that change, getting some curve, in it quickly enough, just it's going to end up somewhere different, right? So you have to act sooner rather than later, right? So I am not saying that, you have to invest incredible degrees in trying to support people to try and get their performance right. You do, I think, have to give people a chance. You do, I think, have to look at an individual and think, well, actually, is there something going on in the context, rather than simply just thinking they're not very capable? I think you do have to think, is there something in their context that's making them perform poorly, or is it them? And that is a good thing to ask, because there is always a risk in hiring a new person, and there is always a cost in getting rid of a person and hiring a new person. So that's just a sensible business decision, right? And I think that actually there is more that leaders can do in terms of exploring what is the context that is helping or hindering someone from performing well. And I hate to plug another one. Well, I don't hate to, but I'm going to. But in Changing Employee Behavior, which is now, I think, on a second edition and translated into multiple languages, the Spanish version, anyone out there? But but we kind of explore what those things of context are and exactly what leaders can do about it. Simply, easy, quickly. But if they're but you do have to act quickly. You do have to analyze it. You do have to act quickly. And if there aren't short-term remedies, then as a leader, then yes, you've got responsibility, and you've got responsibility to act quickly, because as I said, it is the single most common reason why leaders will fail or fail to deliver. Although I should say, just as a side, just to throw another hand grenade on the table quickly, one of the reasons why leadership selection is so difficult these days is that it's not just, you can take the words "these days" off that sentence, is that most leaders don't fail, right? Most leaders don't explode in a ball of flames. What happens to most leaders is that they become average. Right? Bit above, bit below, but they become average. But the problem is that because the world is becoming more uncertain, because the world has become structurally uncertain, structurally far more changeable, that if we used to have a bell curve where we had the numbers of people who were in the high performing bit, right, at the top end, have reduced. And the numbers of people who are in the average bit in the middle have increased significantly. And the numbers of bit who are, actually it's become a bit more skewed. So there are more below average as well, right? Just because it's a far more difficult environment to manage. So it is, and leaders aren't ending up in there most leaders aren't ending up in that area because they are unskilled, or they are bad leaders. They're ending up in that space because they're in really, really difficult circumstances, and they're making suboptimal decisions, or they're making small mistakes, or the people around them aren't performing, or their teams aren't performing quite as well as they need to. And these small little damages to performance are accruing. And they accrue faster than they ever used to because the environment's difficult. And so that's what's happening. It is harder than ever to be a leader and to be a really, really good leader.
You mentioned acting quickly. Could you expand on your model for real behavior change? What are the steps involved?
There's a reason why I'm going to say that, right? And I'm not just being awkward. That is because I am allergic to oversimplified models, and because I trained as a psychologist, right? And I trained as a psychotherapist, but my psychotherapy supervisor was a classically trained Freudian analyst. But then I trained as a systemic psychotherapist, which is all into family therapy and stuff like that. But then as I've grown older, I've become far more behavioral and pragmatic. And if you read any of my books, I have a very simple rule. We cram them full of how-to and techniques, but I have a very simple rule. If the techniques takes longer than 5 minutes, it doesn't go in there, right? Because I'm very simple like that. And when I do coaching engagements, I'm not one of those coaches who kind of does like a 9-session package or a 6-session package, because I tend to believe if you're going to change and if we're going to have success, we're going to see it after 2 or 3 sessions, right? We're going to see some progress. And if we're not going to see progress after 2 or 3 sessions, you know what? We're probably not going to see much. So, or at least we ought to be reviewing why we're meeting, right? And what's going on. So I don't tend to do those longer packages. I do shorter packages. And then if you want to continue, we can, but we do it. I'm very pragmatic and behavioral, and I don't tend to believe in these very simple recipes of you follow ABC. And the way to change behavior tends to be entirely dependent upon the issue that you are addressing. That said, that's when I'm working with an individual, right? That said, I'll throw a couple of things out there. Okay. First of all, I think that the vast majority of leadership challenges that my coaches face, although they may be based in childhood issues or may be based in that, actually can be resolved very, very simply with fairly behavioral techniques. Okay. I think the solutions often are not rocket science. Implementing them tends to take structure and discipline and systematic, and it's the implementing it which tends to be the most difficult bit. Finding time and space and headspace and all of that when you're working, 29 hours a day, right? That tends to be the most difficult thing, right? So, but when working with individuals, I think most issues can be dealt with fairly simply, fairly behaviorally, right? And so my background maybe as a therapist, but rarely do I climb onto a couch or get
how
my
did
coaches to
forensic
climb onto a couch. It happens. It does happen, but not often.
how did forensic psychotherapy change the way you see leadership and power?
So I'm going to answer that question. I'm just going to come back first. Okay. The second thing that I wanted to say to you is that the single biggest determinant of whether someone changes their behavior when you're looking at how to change someone else's behavior is the context they work in. So if you're trying to change an employee's behavior or you're trying to change the culture of a business, look at the level above and change their boss's behavior or change the context that they're working in. And so actually in changing employee behavior, one of the things that we do is we start off by looking at the brainwashing research that came out of the CIA and the Korean War and stuff like that. And actually what happens when you try and force someone to change their behavior and what can be learned from that. It's actually incredibly difficult to force someone to change their behavior if you don't change their context. As you can see in the incredibly I wouldn't say strange, but there's a US phenomenon of teenage boot camps, right? You said which are surprisingly common in the US, where kids are kind of sent off for behavioral modification techniques. In these boot camps, they tend to be run like military establishments. They tend to be have incredibly successful behavioral change results within the camps. 6 months afterwards, very, very low. But that's another matter, right? Because people are released. So the context really matters, right? And it's a bit like if you send me on a sales course, right? And then I come back and then my boss tells me, hey, just ignore all of that. It's rubbish, right? I want you to do this. Guess what? I'm probably not going to do it, right? So, or you send me off on an expensive executive education course, and then guess what? You don't ask me a single question about it or how I'm going to implement it. Or what I've learned, I'm probably not going to do much with it. It's kind of, so context matters, right? Context really is the single most important thing. Now, to come back to your question, which was, what did I learn from forensic psychotherapy? So the first thing I learned about forensic psychotherapy is that, so just to explain to listeners, forensic means working pertaining to the criminal justice system. So I worked in and around prisoners. So that gave me a very, very pragmatic focus, which is why I'm not one of those psychotherapists. I always say to people at the beginning of coaching, if you're after a coach who's going to give you a hug, probably not the right person, right? I'm not one of those coaches, right? I'm a very pragmatic coach. And the reason for that is that the people I was working with were people. So I did a lot of work, for example, working with trying to change the behavior of pedophiles. Now, that's a very serious situation to be in. And if you are not successful, the consequences of that can be very, very serious. Or if you're trying to work with someone to try and stop them changing, if you're trying to stop them taking drugs, right? For them and their families, if you're not successful in helping them, or if they're not successful in helping themselves, sorry, that would have been the correct way of putting it, But if you're not if they're not successful, the consequences for them and their families can be hugely consequential. So I became very pragmatic, pragmatic. And you asked me about power. You slipped in the word power there, and thank you, because that's a wonderful opportunity to plug the last book, which was The Power Trap. And the Power Trap, but actually my work on power really only came out from within organizations, because what I began to see was that there were two things that led me to it. First of all, was I began to see was that leadership was changing the leaders. Many of the leaders that I worked with, simply becoming a leader was changing them, right? And not necessarily in good ways. And the second thing was I came across a really toxic leader who was doing bad things. And someone said, "Oh, power corrupts." It's the old story. And it really, really, and I'm doing my best not to swear profusely here, but insert the expletive of your own choice, right? It really annoyed me. It really annoyed me. Because power doesn't corrupt, right? And this brings me back to the whole thing of authorship and accountability. Power does not corrupt people.
Do you think it's an amplifier for what lies underneath?
Correct. And so when you dig into, because there are plenty of people who have power who don't do corrupt things, right? And every time you say power corrupts, it excuses those people. Well, it's almost not their fault; it's power's fault. Right?
Well, it makes the empathetic people stay away from power because they don't want to be part of the corruption.
So so it does. Power does do things to people, right? And it can amplify things, and it can lead people to do some weird stuff. But so we started having a look at. So that's what led me into this research of what is it that power does. And let's be really clear: power is not a friendly partner. On the one hand, power is awesome, right? We all want it because I could want it a bit, right? Because we could do wonderful things with it. As a leader, it's the elixir of getting things done, right? It's the authority, it's the control, it's the influence that enables us to do stuff. Without it, well, try being a leader without it, right? You couldn't. Don't think. It's what enables us to do things. It also, just on a personal level, is what enables us to keep our families safe, I guess, right? To achieve certain things within life, right? Power is
useful. Can I attach
right?
a question to your answer without derailing you? It's a short one. What's the difference between confidence and denial? When you mentioned power being necessary to affect change, some entrepreneurs, for example, need to believe in something before it exists and convince other people that it will be a thing in order to get the momentum to create it, and therefore perhaps have that power. But it seems like a slippery slope or a difficult balance.
Yeah. Okay. So look, power can do many things to people, right? And in the book, we pull out six things. One of the things it does, of course, probably the most famous, is it's a wonderful ego booster, right? It's, it boosts our ego, and that can be good, right? For many leaders, it can be an ego, that can help, not always. And it can lead some people into overconfidence, right? Now, that's when you get into some of this really interesting research that some overconfidence, just like some narcissism, they don't advertise this on TV, but it's true, low levels of overconfidence and low levels of narcissism are positively related to performance. Because you know what? If you're walking into that room full of investors, you need to be able to do that thing where you walk into the Western bar room and swing those doors open and, and the piano player stops, right? And, you need that, right? You need to be able to do that thing, right? Well, actually, there've been studies done, and we cite them in the book, and we show them in the book, and show that these types of people are more able to raise funds, right? Now, we show that can also then tip over, right? Unfortunately, if you then give those people a bit too, what can happen to those individuals is they get a taste of success. There's wonderful studies showing that if you then give those people a taste of success, it then boosts their ego, boosts their confidence. It goes, and as it goes up beyond a certain level, well, that's when it gets troublesome, right?
It seems
especially when
like
you combine it with
celebrities
some
could
of,
really use your support as well, because that seems like an industry that's fraught with some of the
do you know what?
scenarios you describe.
This brings me back to There But by the Grace of God Go I, because sometimes I see some of these movie stars who've been child stars, right? And have grown up in it. And
Mm.
and you see them, and they've probably been right the way they've been through the gamut. They've had their wild days, and they've ended up as in their 40s or 50s, and they sound relatively grounded. And I genuinely look at them with admiration, because I think you've been through it and you've come out the other side relatively grounded. And I don't know how you do that,
Probably
because
takes a village.
it's, yeah. So I had some colleagues who worked in the music and movie industry and ended up working the same field as I did, and none of them had nice things to say about what that industry does to people. And I mean, I'm not going to disappear into gossip now, but it was, yeah. So to come back, so one of the problems with this growing with more overconfident is that one of the other things that that power does to us is it makes us more distant from the people that we lead. And in two particular ways. First of all, people stop talking to you. People stop telling you the truth. So and partially that is because, well, for starters, the openness never exists anyway, right? No one's completely open with you. If you ever meet anyone who's completely open, they're probably, well, yeah. I mean, if you ever meet anyone who's completely open, they're probably single, unemployed, and friendless, right? If my wife asks me, do I look good in this? There is only a range of acceptable responses. if a boss asks you, is this idea completely mad, or is it okay? You cannot turn around to them and say, frankly, Phil, I think you're a moron, right? That may be the thought in your head, but you can't say it to most people, right? It may be the thought in your head, but you know what? You filter it out. And as you become higher, as you grow into more senior roles, the more likely people are to filter out what they say to you. And you know what? If you're in a bad mood one day, or you're just feeling tired, or people look at you and you think, oh, he's not smiling so much, right? Or actually take it, what, David, you know what? You look like a smiley guy. One of the problems with me is that I'm English. I don't smile by nature, right? And that means that people already start filtering what they say to me. The moment they walk into the room, they start filtering. They think, he's not a smiley guy. So unconsciously, they start filtering what they say to me, right? So wow. You just have a bad day, people start filtering what they say to you, right? And the more powerful you become, the more influence you have, the more that they want to please you. Or let's say that I became, I don't know, the president of a country, and I decide to hold a cabinet meeting, and I kind of encourage people to be ingratiating to me and tell me how I'm the best president there's ever been, right? That kind of behavior would instill the fear of what's-its in people, right? And they're even more likely to start filtering information to me. By the way, if someone was a supporter of me, they should be really, really angry when they see that. If they were a supporter of me, they should be really angry when they see that.
Limits the data set, to your point.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So the problem is that people are becoming, is you're less likely to be informed. Now, it gets even worse than that, right? Because on every single metric that has been used, the evidence shows that leaders become less empathetic, less able to accurately gauge the thoughts and feelings of the people that they lead, the higher they rise. Now, I've never come across a leader who I've said, are you an empathetic boss? I've never come across a boss who's gone, no, I'm not an empathetic boss. We all like to think that we're empathetic, right? Every boss that I tell this bit of research to, well, a lot of them, the majority don't like the sound of it. I don't like the sound of it, right? Part of my brain is I'm nodding intellectually, but emotionally going, that doesn't apply to me, right? And because we don't like the thought of it. But it's a natural consequence. If people are filtering what they tell us, of course we're going to have less insight into what they're thinking and feeling. So we've got less insight into people. They're not being as open with us. The information reaching to us is decaying. and becoming less and less, and it's becoming a smaller and smaller data set. We're becoming more and more confident, overconfident. I don't know about you, but I'm already beginning to think this doesn't sound like a recipe for success, right? And you start putting people in pressurized environments, right, where they have to make quick decisions, or they have to make high risk decisions in uncertain environments, and these things are going to clash. And that is why it is so common to see some entrepreneurs who are incredibly successful early on, Elon, who then find themselves in different circumstances and it just doesn't work. Or they start making mistakes, or they're just not as successful and they just can't sustain it because they start making more and more mistakes, because they're working on a weaker and weaker data set. They're less and less able to read what's going on. They're further and further away from the very environment that they're trying to lead. Power changes people. Power reduces every single leader who holds it. And the more of it that they have, and the longer they have it for, the more that it will reduce them. And those are just two of the things that I've mentioned. And there are 4 others that we mentioned in the book.
I have a question that might be a bit abstract, but I think it's kind of germane to what you just shared there. I've been recently reflecting on my responsibility and perhaps the collective responsibility of holding leaders accountable, because there's there's a spotlight on them, heroes, celebrities, leaders, and yet we shine that spotlight, we, the people around them. And on one sense, I feel like we kind of delegate to them, we defer to them, we use their accomplishment in one domain as a proxy for likely accomplishment in another domain. And then we're surprised that just because they're a really good, sports player here, they're not necessarily good in this other responsibility. To what degree do you think, I guess before that, why do we do that? Why do we assume that because someone is good in one thing, they'll be good in another? And I guess if you don't mind a double parter, do you think that some of the responsibility is on us when leaders fall astray?
It's called the halo effect. And we all do it, right? We do it with friends. We do it with kids. You seem like a nice guy, right? I mean, I've enjoyed this conversation. I'm going to generalize from it, right? I'm generalizing. See, I just did it. I just said, you seem like a nice guy. You're probably a mass murderer, for all I know, right? I mean,
quote of the podcast.
I mean, with those glasses, for sure you are, right? Sorry, I've got maybe.
Well, the nicer someone makes himself look, you have to wonder what's the underlying motivation,
right? So so clearly I must be a very nice guy looking this bad. So it's sorry, I'm going to disappear down a psychoanalytic. Hold on a second. But that's why, right? We tend to over generalize things. It's a natural mental psychological heuristic. We tend to do it. And our brains are really good at that. And that's because we try and predict the environment. I mean, people always think that our brains, our memories are for remembering, right? And the great Daniel C. Dennett was pointed this out, right? That memories aren't for remembering, memories are for predicting, right? That's why we remember things, not to try and recall them, but to try and predict what they're going to do next time. And so we generalize from them. Are we to blame from it? I think there is one of the things that I've talked about elsewhere quite a lot, and that I think is particularly poisonous and happening around us at the moment. And I'm not. I think I'm going to sidestep your question a bit, and forgive me. Bring me back to it if you want to. Is I think there's something a bit more poisonous happening further around us, which is affecting us, and I blame CNN. 1990, CNN was launched, I think. 24-hour news comes along. And I don't blame CNN. It's just that was the first 24 news channel, right? And it changes news. It changes media, because all of a sudden journalists have to go hunting for news, right? they have to go hunting for news and breaking news and keep it coming, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't just keep repeating the same headlines for the day, right? It's not just once a day. You need to keep it coming. And breaking news every 5 seconds. I'm looking at you, CNN. For that one, I do blame you, right? And then we get social media. We get Facebook. And I think it's 2009 when in the same year, we get the first algorithm launched. We get Twitter launching retweets. We get likes appearing as well on Facebook. And you can see it building from there, that it matches it almost precisely on graphs, that the focus on image management and image consciousness begins to grow within society. And it doesn't stop at the office door. You can see it on LinkedIn, right? Just look at LinkedIn, for goodness sake, right? There's so many slick people in there that I feel so, I mean, if I wasn't so old, I'd be really worried, right? But at my age, there's only so much you can do with this, as my wife likes to point out. Which I probably should be more worried about. But I'm old. There is only so much, right? And it's this image consciousness and image management. And then you layer on top of that, we've had cancel culture. And you know what? That sticks in people's brains. I'm not saying it was a bad thing. Bits of it were overdue. But it sticks in people's brain, and some of that residue gets in the way of information flow, gets in the way of people speaking up, especially with the image consciousness. People are more aware of the price of saying the wrong thing, getting things wrong, right? And then, so it feels to me that we're wandering into a perfect storm with leaders for leadership and power. That you've got, on the one hand, leaders under more pressure and more stress, which amplifies some of the impacts that power can have on people in terms of distancing them from people, right? And if they're less likely to get kind of negative feedback, then they're more likely to experience the overconfidence, ego thing. But you're also getting then as well the image consciousness, right? So there's a greater focus. The people rising to the top are more likely to be those who are great at projecting a good image. To get to the top, you need to be better and better at projecting a good image. Now, I know that politics and business are different, but this is most extreme and most visible in the political sphere. And in both Britain and America, and I'm really sorry, I don't know Canadian politics that well, but I bet bottom dollar that, and Canadian dollar, that it's exactly the same there as well, right? That if you compare the politicians today to 50 years ago, I bet you they're as slick as. The British journalist David Dimbleby was asked 5 or 6 years ago, do today's politicians lie more than they used to?
Oh, okay. What was the answer?
And he kind of replied that he didn't think that they lied anymore that they used to. He just thought that the quality of lies had fallen, and that the quality of politicians had fallen. And that was, it's just that the lies used to be better, right? And that the politicians used to be better, right? And it's I think his point is that there's so much slick and gloss, right? There's so much on image these days. And it is creeping into the workplace. And I think any leader sitting in here who's listening, sitting, you may be standing, you may be jogging, I don't know. But if you're listening to this and you're in a company of more than 1,000 people and you're above the age of 40, think back to what it was like 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And do you honestly think that people are no less political, no less preening and performance than they were 15, 20 years ago? Because the experience of most of the leaders that I see is that they feel that it has grown far more that way. And that the closer to the top of organizations you get, the more that is the case. That performance and performance management, not of the people below you, but the performance that you are giving to the people above you and managing up has become more important. More important. And again, that amplifies some of the worst aspects that you can find. So are we to blame? I think it's too easy to say yes to that. But I do think there are broad societal level shifts that have gone on over the last 10 to 15 years that have had a significant impact on how people are behaving within organizations that are not good or healthy or useful and are making leaders' lives harder. And are actually making the job of driving good performance harder. The number of mid-level leaders I meet who say that, they're working so hard and finding it so difficult to get things done, right? They just feel like it's getting harder and harder to get things done.
Well,
and the number of top-level leaders I work with who are saying they're finding it harder and harder, to bring me back to what I said right at the beginning, to maintain a grip on the organization, to stop drift, to stop people's focus from drifting, to keep people focused on what matters, to stop the performance of the organization from drifting, right? To just keep people clear and focused on what matters. And I do think that we've shifted from an age where 10, 15 years ago, everyone was talking, we need to be agile, we need to be adaptable. I think actually the challenges have shifted now. And I think these days it's about how do we maintain grip on what we've got? And yes, of course, we still need to change sometimes when circumstances change. But you know what? We need to be clear. We need to maintain a grip. We need to stop strategic drift.
Well said.
Anyway.
Where should people follow your work?
So they can find me on nikkinley.com. They can find me on LinkedIn. I've got a Substack. Substack Nik I'm going to mumble off, and hopefully people won't notice that, but they can Google that.
We can put the link in the show notes.
At all good booksellers. But reach out to me. You can reach out to me via the website. You can reach out to me via LinkedIn, and of course, just thanks for having me on, David.
Pleasure. Fascinating conversation. I could speak to you for 3 hours, but maybe we can do a part 2 sometime.
Love it. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you.